Welcome everybody here and online folks. Happy to be hosting my longtime friend Cleo Wölfle Hazard. We've known each other since 1995 when we started our undergrad together at Hampshire College. Um, More recently, Cleo was at the University of Washington, and he has since made an exciting move to the University of California Extension, where he is a fire advisor in Northern California in Humboldt County, working with both with UC Extension and the Crook tribe, which we'll talk about today. So he'll be sharing a lot from his book, Underflows, that's the correct title, and which came out of his PhD work at Berkeley. We were also at Berkeley at the same time. And then also out of his postdoc work at UC Santa Cruz in science and technology studies and feminist theory. So I'll hand it over to Cleo. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Sarek, and thank you all for coming. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. I've been, so the book Underflows, Queer, Trans Ecologies, and River Justice came out in 2022, but because of the pandemic, it's been like this slow rollout, and that's been really exciting to think about the book, which really talks a lot about my own kind of queer trans experience as a field ecologist and being trained to be a field ecologist, but also talks about some of the later research projects that I have undertaken, trying to figure out what does queer trans ecology actually mean and do, and what difference does it make in your results for people, for other species, for rivers. So it's been exciting being on this second round of the book tour this year. I was at Pomona College last month, and now here to try to present different aspects of my research program that might mesh with some of what my hosts are doing. So since we're here in the soil world, I'm going to talk somewhat about my work on the Klamath River, which you see here. This is a Tishonic, which we'll talk about a little bit, and this is a cultural fire, prescribed fire, kind of being lit on this river bar next to the river, but also on the Duwamish River, which is Seattle's only river. It's a super fun site, brownfield with a lot of contaminants. So I'll be talking about these two pretty different projects, but then grounding them theoretically in the book and these questions around method. So before I get into the slides and all that, I just wanted to start by reading a little bit from the introduction. And so as Sark mentioned, my training is both, my undergrad is in geology, and then I have ecology and feminist science studies and indigenous studies as my fields, and I'm also kind of a social scientist. So the talk also has these different genres and modes, and so they might be unfamiliar to you depending on where you're from. So there'll be, figures, and then there'll be reading. So just if you feel like you don't know what's going on, it's okay. Okay, so the introduction is called Water's Invitation. Rivers matter for queer trans life. Rivers have long been places of encounter for those outside of straight settler propriety. They are brown in the way that Jose Esteban Munoz describes, quote, the way in which they suffer and strive together, but also the commonality of their ability to flourish under duress and pressure. They smolder with life and persistence. Queer trans people make joyous moves of solidarity when we swim in rivers and splash along other shorelines, to wear what we like to the beach, to see and support each other, to be admired in our bodies without apology. Such everyday acts of life, love, and dreaming big transgress settler norms of sexuality and family and require uprising and political transformation. During a pandemic year, as police violence and federal inaction amplified suffering in Black and Brown communities, Black trans matriarch Cyan Taylor shouted, "We want to live," from the stage at the 2020 March for Black Trans Lives. As Taylor told the 10,000 supporters gathered in Brooklyn, for trans and queer people, especially those most marginalized by whiteness and settler colonialism, quote, "Society has neither given us our rewards nor dealt with our deaths in a way where we felt held." Rivers can become spaces to practice these political transformations and transgressions in the everyday. In these pages, I trace contact points in queer trans strategy and Indigenous and environmental justice movements and propose that deepening their alliance can push river science and policy to center marginalized people's knowledge, relations, and management. By centering queer of color and trans critiques in environmental politics, I aim to show how Indigenous, Black, Brown, and other radical traditions in which queer, trans, and two-spirit people have always played key roles are crucial to meeting the intersecting challenges of climate change, settler colonial legacies of environmental harm, and gendered violence. Uniting queer, trans and queer of color theory with environmental justice thought has enabled me to develop cross-cultural collaborations that mobilize conceptual underflows, subjugated narratives in science, water politics, and environmental policy. I'll talk more about underflows in a little bit. By reading these collaborations as queer, trans, feminist interventions into river science, I propose ways to transfigure conceptual surface flows, water and salmon governance, and watershed management writ large. So this book is like pretty theoretical, but it's also very grounded. I was actually talking to a Karuk collaborator today, and he was saying, you know, your book is not so it is theory, but it also has substance. So some of the substance takes place in these places. So in the top, you see the Puget Lowlands, there's Seattle, the Duwamish River. Down here is the Klamath Mountain Range. So this is California, Oregon, Washington. And then these are kind of united by this ecoregion that includes, you know, certain species like the Gamble oak, these valley systems, these mountain systems. So, you know, in driving up and down the I-5 corridor between these places, I've thought a lot about their connections. There's also, you know, intertribal connections. The tribes that I have worked with specifically, just want to acknowledge, you know, the lands and waters where I lived and worked in Seattle, the Duwamish tribe, as well as the Karuk tribe, who I work with a lot, and highlight this real rent Duwamish, which is just an interesting way for an unrecognized tribe to people kind of voluntarily pay rent to them who live in Seattle based on their income. And so this is an interesting strategy for reciprocity and relation building. So I'm just going to go briefly a little bit more into these two river basins. So you can see here the Klamath Basin. You can see it's mostly made up of national forest land. In green, the yellow dotted line is the Karuk Aboriginal territory. And then these black dots are these 4 dams that are in the process of being removed. It's very exciting. If you haven't checked it out, it's like really, really cool. And then this yellow dot is Tishanik, which is the place you saw the photograph of, and it's one of the ceremonial centers for Karuk people. So this is a shot from the dam removal. I did my undergrad on the Milltown Dam removal and got to see all the sediment moving around, and it's just very super exciting right now. The snow melt is starting, so a lot of this will be underwater. If you have a chance to get out there in the next couple of years, it's a really exciting place to be. In my new position and over the last few years, my work has been evolving to think about relations between fire and water. So here you see an example of good fire in a coppice willow stand at Tishanik. So these plants are used by basket weavers and they need particular conditions. So fire produces these long straight shoots. It also kills the bugs that can make the sticks break. I learned a lot about this from Lisa Moorhead-Hillman, who's one of my long-term collaborators. And here we are picking willow roots out of sand. So they grow really nice and straight in sandbars. So one of the things we're doing in this river restoration project is trying to complexify the environment that's been simplified by mining to include more specific kind of river forms that are useful. And then Lisa likes to use this example. This is a basket cap that's almost finished. So women and men also wear these caps, and this one has about 7 different species of plants and also porcupine quills in it. And so she uses it as an example of, in order to make this cap, you need to have fire, you need to have floods, because you need to have these plants, you need thousands of sticks. And so, you know, if you have a cap, you know that you're doing something right. So there's these kind of holistic ways of thinking about fire and water together that Lisa and I have done a lot of thinking about. On the Duwamish River, This is a project with 4 PIs. I'm kind of stepping out of that role, but still involved. And then a PhD student, Amr Sheikh. Dr. Melanie Malone is the kind of principal investigator, and then also Britt Johnson and Catherine D'Almeida. And so this is again in Seattle, and we're kind of focused at first, and I'll talk about this Puget Creek watershed, and all of these colors here are cement kiln dust, which is a byproduct of burning limestone that was spread all over this watershed and is now causing a lot of problems with water quality and alkalinity. Uh, and yeah, the Duwamish Valley, it's an industrial area in Seattle. A lot of people don't think of it as native land. Of course, all land is native land, but it is really cool. At certain seasons, you go down there and there's an active commercial fishery. And a lot of this is as a result of a lot of activism and organizing during the 60s around the Bolt decision. So if you don't know about that, I'm happy to talk about it. It's a fascinating story. But recently, this area of the lower Duwamish River has become a sentinel for climate change. So we had a storm in December of 2022 where there was just really large storm was kind of pushing the tidewater up, and then there was ice storm that coated everything with an inch of ice, and then it got warm and all the water melted. So we had this amount of flooding that was not predicted to happen for 30 years. So it's a real wake-up call. It's flooded out 63 homes, raw sewage backed up into people's basements. And so you know, these densely populated, majority immigrant neighborhoods in Seattle, as in other places, are really vulnerable. And so with community-directed research, right, what are the questions that communities have that we could potentially answer as researchers, and how would that change our research if we were going to do that? This is a close-up of some of the cement kiln dust. Really interesting biogeochemistry happening here. And some community-directed sampling. So this is a close-up of this area, and we're trying to, understand both how it's affecting the biota and also how many, depending on what they use to fire those kilns, there could be a lot of metals and other things in that. So that's just the grounding in the two rivers. So now I'm going to talk a bit more about underflows, as I use the term in the book. I'm going to talk about field work and some queer thinking about that. And then I'll talk a little more about these two projects, and then close with reading from the last chapter of the book, which is called Cruising the Waterfront with Jose Esteban Mendoza. So this is the book. This is Cyan Taylor, who I read a quote from her. And so in the book, I talk about, what is queer, what is trans, what is this intersection of queer and trans feminist thought, and what is restoration. And so thinking about queer not only as an identity, but as kind of a political formation, and also as a body of theory, right, that helps us to think about kinship with other species, or think about thinking about different ways of crossing or transgressing boundaries. And then in terms of restoration, thinking about, okay, well, what is the settler legacy of that term? What are other terms, revitalization, rehabilitation, that might be more appropriate in certain contexts? And overall in the book, I'm asking these three questions. So what politics of solidarity can queer trans feminist tactics bring into river science and management? How might queer and trans modes of relation among and beyond the human reshape science and governance along rivers? And how might taking science and field practice seriously as grounds for queer and trans ecological thought reshape queer, trans, and environmental studies? So I'll just read a little bit about this question right here. So what is queer trans feminist ecology? As I live and think it, queer trans feminist ecology is an unfolding practice, mood, and orientation to solidarity and multiplicity that holds space for different kinds of thought. in the field and with other than human beings. This book traces and deploys underflows as a mode of thinking and strategizing in feminist science studies as a field, a field that uses feminist politics and theories to critique and transform scientific practice, goals, and ethics. The book's object is queer and trans ecology in two senses. First, Underflows as approach shows queer and trans ecologies. Tracing conceptual and material underflows is a queer strategy that does the work of showing queer affinities. Queer in the sense of resisting and refusing norms of cis-heteronormative settler colonial water politics and land relations. I figure these hegemonic politics and relations as surface flows, as in the part of the river that you can see and swim in contrast to the underflows that seep beneath the streambed unseen. And so underflows, for those of you who haven't thought in Greek recently, this comes from the hypereic zone. So hydrologists will be familiar with this term, but it came up a lot with the publisher. They're like, what about undercurrents? And I'm like, no, it's underflows. It's underneath. So you're walking in the stream, you're walking on the gravel, and in that gravel or the sand or whatever's the substrate, in that substrate is water, and that water is the hypereic. There's also, as you can see in this picture, there's lots of, so there's in the spaces between the gravel, there's fish, there's bugs, there's little salmon go down there to before they emerge from their nests. There's a lot of biogeochemical cycling, nutrients, and then the fish come up out of the gravel when they get too big to fit in the spaces. So this figure is also showing the kind of streams that I studied during my PhD research, which are intermittent streams, which you probably don't have here. But in the summer, our streams look like your streams. They flow, in the winter, they flow continuously. And then in the summer, as the water table drops, the riffles dry, and then there's these pools. And so fish can persist there for some time, but because there's not oxygen being reintroduced, the oxygen levels drop and eventually they'll die. So this was basically my PhD, was like, how long can they survive? What can we do to, what's happening when the dissolved oxygen levels are dropping? So from this kind of physical underflows, I started to think more metaphorically about what might be the underflows to these surface flows of river politics. So underflows are this book's central concern, both in their watery materiality and in the discourses and politics that shape river governance. Just as the water in the hypereic mixes with the stream's surface flow and deep water, conceptual underflows percolate and influence conceptual surface flows of settler colonial river management and the mainstream ecology, hydrology, social science, and economics that shape it. I break open the theoretical and associative potentials of underflows by exploring latent discourses that lie hidden or disregarded, like fluid underflows are hidden beneath the stream's bed. So I'm not going to go too much into that, but there's a lot about lots of different underflows in the book. One of which I will just briefly mention. So one of these surface flows is manifest destiny, right? So the idea, the doctrine from 1844 that white man was destined to cross the plains, rain follows the plow, all of these ideas, right? And its latencies. And so when, manifest destiny, this was a DuPont ad from 1935, that, you should use dynamite to straighten your streams and everything will be better, right? So we can see evidence, of these. And then one of the underflows, in a way, was these experiments to reintroduce beavers in the 1930s, sometimes by parachute. And there's actually a video you can see of this if you haven't already. So talk a lot about different ways to think about these tendencies and these kind of latencies that have been resisting these surface flows all along. Okay, that's underflows. So fieldwork. So the book Underflows has these underflows in it, which were these kind of pieces that didn't really fit. Sometimes they were more like autoethnography. They just were exceeding what is like permissible in an academic book. But fortunately, my editor at Press was amazing. And she said, yeah, you can put them in, just make them be interludes. And then at the last minute, I said, oh, they should be underflows. So I'll just read a little bit from underflow number 2. Find it. Um, okay. Underflow 2, being in the field. I had a body before gender. My perception of my body emerged co-constituted with LA's dry culvert streams, with backlots, and with small strips of waste grass along the fences of asphalted schoolyards. These were spaces where, alone, I had no gender, but just a body, not seen in a mirror, but rather experienced through touch and contact with dirt, grass, and water. In later fieldwork, I added a choreography, a rhythm to this foundational method of observation. In Montana, studying geology as an undergrad, I learned the random walk method of pebble counts, bending, immersing neoprene hand in ice, touching a pebble behind my right foot without looking, measuring its intermediate axis, calling out the measurement, replacing the rock, taking a step in a random direction, bending again. This choreography embedded a relation of noticing into my muscles and skin. Studying how the reservoir sediments wash downstream after the Milltown Dam removal on Montana's Clark Fork, I first practiced movement as measurement, freezing as I dipped my hand into the water to grab a stone and lean into oar strokes in an inflatable raft on the Blackfoot arm of the Milltown Reservoir. My thrill at these bodily encounters with rock and water was tempered by social anxiety. On big rivers like the Clark Fork, geomorphology field campaigns require teams of people, and all of the social interactions around these field days were intensely gendered. I was not out as trans and so got read as a cisgender male, but off. My self-identification was more genderqueer butch, but where does one bring these nuances up amid classroom discussions of crystal structures and physics of groundwater flow models? In my lab, there were no women, no other trans people, no other queers. Field and office conversation tended to heterosexual locker room banter, while programs for gender equity in STEM at least made some space for solidarity among women-identified scientists. I was afraid that being out as trans would expose me to exclusion or violence or would close off access to scientific opportunity. So I opted to pass and take the cuts and scars invisibility inflicts. I escaped to the field more often than not solo, where gender as a social category receded some. The feeling was like peeling my wetsuit off after a day of snorkeling to count fishes. A lightness, a lack of constriction, a dissolution of a sharp boundary between my body and the world. Solo, I sidestepped the social cues that signal right and wrong gender. I evaded rejection and threats of violence, focused on counting cutthroat trout in a backwater pool. So there's a little more, but that gives you the sense of it. And this is just some of that fieldwork that I was doing. Um, and so then in the next chapter, I talk about field time as open-ended time. I talk about kind of more about the embodied nature of that and some intersections with disability studies and queer of color theory around time. So I'll read just a little bit of that. So in 6 Ways of Looking at Crypt Time, Ellen Samuels writes about the body-mind's resistance to becoming someone whose inner clock was attuned to my own physical state rather than the external routines of a society ordered around bodies that were not like mine. For me and for many who continue in this work for decades, field time becomes crypt time. Field work slows once one can no longer perform its movements because of pain, crushed discs, or a third set of knees, like my field mentor had. Instead, we rely on assistance. The field changes then, following a pattern that Samuels describes. For crypt time is broken time. It requires us to break in our bodies and minds to new rhythms, new patterns of thinking and feeling and moving through the world. So one thing that I do in this chapter, for those of you who might be in performance studies, is I use kind of methods from performance studies to read field work as a performance and kind of actually look at the motions that we do, and both as humans and then in relation to soil or water or other species. And I talk a lot about somewhat kind of inspired by Jose Munoz's feelings around kind of how affects and emotions kind of might pass between people and other species. So I'm not going to go too much into that though, because I want to get to the other while we still have time. So in the community-led research there's a lot to say about this, but what I want to start is with this figure that my students and I put together for um, a special issue of American Naturalist that was focused on feminist science studies, which was very interesting experience to go through that. And so what we did is we took a figure of like the normal scientific research process, and then we expanded it to include different places where community or tribal input might affect the process. And so um, in all of these processes, we start with relationship building and then thinking about consent, right? So is there an actual desire? Is there a request from a community? There's co-design of the research, co-generation of knowledge. Um, in that, there might be sharing of resources from the community or sharing of resources to the community, including funding, but also other kinds of resources. There's more relationship building. There's co-analysis of research data that's non-extractive and transparent, ideally. And then, and then there's this part of like, well, okay, we have this data, we analyze it together, but what does it actually mean? And then this idea of positionality. So, how does where we are situated, either in a university or not, all of different life experience that might matter to our understanding of this data comes into this reflection and discussion. And then, there's always this commitment to serving community, sharing and evaluation as we're kind of thinking about next steps and should we do more research or not? What should that research be? So this is really different from how I was taught to do science, right? And so I just want to put this up there kind of as a framework, and then talk through two different cases of how I've tried to do this in my own work. So we're going to start with the Duwamish. And so this is some work that Amr Sheikh did as part of producing this Waterlines map, which is a historical map of reconstructing Seattle's pre-contact hydrology and vegetation. And these are some of some of the kinds of sources that we are using in these projects. So in trying to understand the histories of the river and how that might affect contaminant mobilization. So what some of the work that Amr did early on was to put together those sources into this map of the prehistoric elevations and just what kind of soils that you would find. And so then sharing these with community members helps to make sense of some things like why South Park flooded where it did. It's an old oxbow. So we're working with the main partners, Duwamish River Community Coalition, which has their own research and their own action plan. And so this is their report from a few years ago that's highlighting one of these really key areas. This is the mouth, this is the Elliott Bay, downtown Seattle, and this is Kellogg Island. This is the last remaining oxbow of the river that wasn't straightened during the construction of the port of Seattle. And the Duwamish have a longhouse right over here, but this was a village site called Push in southern Lachute, and this is a restoration project where local volunteers come out and pull weeds and are trying to revitalize plant species. And so one question that the community had was, what are the contaminant levels in these sediments? People are out here touching them, getting stuck up to their knees in the mud, falling down in the mud. Is this okay? Can we get some testing done? So this whole river corridor is a Superfund site, and there was a certain amount of testing that was done, but it wasn't necessarily in the places that the community was interested in. The EPA wasn't interested in doing more testing, and so over a few years of starting out with that smaller project in Pigeon Creek that I told you with, we came up with a plan. We got a grant from a different part of the EPA. So this is part where maybe in the Q&A we'll turn off the recording. We can talk more about that. To do the contaminant sampling of this among other sites, where basically all the sites where people are coming down to access the river to fish or for kids to play or whatever. And this is an area where we found really high levels of PCBs. And so then, the question is then, well, what do we do? EPA wants us to do one thing, the community wants another thing. And so it gets very complicated, right? In figuring out like, what are our commitments? And what we decided was our commitments were to the community organizations, making sure they have the data first, making sure they understand what the data might mean in terms of screening levels and risk, and that they are basically guiding us in how we're releasing those data or communicating them to the EPA. But it does get very, it does get very political. And so this is my colleague Catherine de Almeida works a lot on waste landscape. She's a landscape architect. And so this is one of her ideas that, landscapes associated with waste, excess, and undesired create vulnerability within and surrounding their sites, which are typically relegated to the peripheries of urban environments, along with marginalized communities. And so, thinking about the Duwamish and thinking about this waterfront as a queer ecology was really helpful to me in understanding how restoration might proceed here that was inclusive of people who might not otherwise be considered, right? And so this project does consider immigrant families, native fishers, like other people who are marginalized, but it doesn't necessarily consider the unhoused people who live along the river, or sex workers who work there, or gay men who are cruising for sex in the bushes. Like, these are people who are so undesired that they're not included. And so I think so in thinking about how might we kind of build on these data and actually work for restoration, it's been really helpful for me to think with Jose Munoz about the Brown Commons. And so I'm going to read a little bit of that chapter right here. And this is like, just to say, like, this is a part of the work that is like, it's not against, right, helping families or helping youth have access, but it's also, there is a conflict maybe with having youth and unhoused people in waterfront park, but what are the ways that we can like address that conflict without like dehumanizing certain people, right? And so this is one of the landscape architecture students projects you can look at while I'm reading this. So this chapter is called With and for the Multitude, Cruising a Waterfront with Jose Esteban Munoz. And so it's inspired by this talk that Munoz gave shortly before his death in 2013. And there were like a few videos of it, and I had to kind of, the audio was really bad, and I had to listen a lot of times to transcribe it. Now you can read it in his book, Sense of Brown. So it's the beginning of that. So I'm going to read just but part of my process in this was really like, I had to listen to that talk about 30 times just to get the transcript. So I really got into this, like this rhythm of him performing this. And it was this kind of, like this way that you have these, academic ancestors you never meet, but this is the transmission from them. So this is the beginning of that talk. This is Munoz. Brown Commons is meant to signify at least two things. One is the commons of brown people, places, feelings, sounds, animals, minerals, and other objects. What makes them brown is partially the way in which they suffer and strive together, but also the commonality of their ability to flourish under duress and pressure. They are brown in part because they have been devalued by the world outside their commons. Their brownness can be known by tracking the ways that global and local forces constantly attempt to degrade them and diminish their vitality. But they're also brown insofar as they smolder with life and persistence. They are brown because brown is a common color shared by a commons that is of and for the multitude. And so Munoz himself was not like an environmental scientist. He didn't even really write about the environment. He was a New Yorker. He wrote about performance art. But I think that his method is really um, vital to environmental studies and activism. Um, Brown comments that our queer ecologies are an underflow to environmental justice movements, showing them other ways to move, to shimmy, to take on capitalism, to be outrageous. This underflow brings feeling into discussion of species extinction and unavoidable sacrifice, cracking open flat bureaucratic affects with queer of color critique. Think, for example, the term brownfield. Policies speak for contaminated urban land that must be remediated before it can be redeveloped in a tax-generating property. Munoz invokes a Brown Commons that refuses such logics of land and water um, as resources, and also refuses the equation um, of brown with bad, contaminated, and in need of purification. He refuses to oppose human life with a non-human, non-sentient environment, instead centering connection and shared life worlds through cascading descriptions of how singularities make relations across species and kinds. This way of relation making jibes with how a transfigured watershed body can bring beaver, salmon, humans, and other watershed inhabitants into renewed reciprocity. Take, for example, this passage. People and things in the commons I'm rendering are brown because they share an organicism that is not, I'm sorry, this is quote, that is not solely organic of the natural, as much as it is a certain brownness, which is an embeddedness in a vast and pulsating social world. Again, not organic like self-sufficient organism, but organic in the way the world is brown, and objects within the world touch and are co-present, end quote. The formulation, quote, not solely organic as a natural, end quote, opens a space for lively vitality within unnatural landscapes like brownfields. Munoz's theorization of the organic as a circuit among the social and the natural matters for reparative ecological politics um, for at least two reasons. And then I'm not going to read all of that, but um, in short, it's thinking, one, organic is carbon-based, so we can think a lot about carbon and its transformations in these systems. And then also not organic, like self-sufficient. It centers relations among people, but it also extends, agency to objects, the natural, to influence culture and politics. So this idea that things that aren't humans can also, are part of culture and influence culture and can shape that. And what so I want to read a little bit more Munoz. And this part is on cruising as method. So let's see that we're getting a little bit short on time. But I'm still going to read a little bit on cruising as method. Cruising as method is rooted in a desire, and this is actually cruising. So Munoz's first book, for those of you who aren't queer theory people, is called Cruising Utopia. And so he talks a lot about cruising as method. So this is what I'm reading is like not all my ideas, but many of his ideas also. So cruising as method is rooted in a desire that includes and exceeds sex and intensifies everyday encounters such that objects, quote, smolder with life and persistence, end quote. I cruise waterfronts and streams in a way that feels similar. This cruising practice is an underflow that relates to and can transfigure urban ecological science and planning along shorelines whose inhabitants, quote, suffer and strive together. Such cruising is a queer underflow to field science practices in three senses. First, as a way of seeing and relating to tides, slimes, and incrustations of shellfish on industrial debris. Queer ecologists and artists materialize queer futures in artwork and encounters. Second, as a theoretical orientation to queer affiliations made beyond heterosexual encounter and pair bonding. Queer orientations to ecology and evolutionary biology research may give rise to new hypotheses for study and action. Third, as collective politics influenced by queer of color people and thought against policies designed to exterminate queers and other outcasts. Black Lives Matter and water protector movements connect climate and water justice to demands for decolonization and reparations, and enact queer futurity through mutual aid, urban gardening, and ceremony as a core element of protest. Cruising waterfront queer ecologies with Munoz brings into focus circuits of feeling that pass between people, places, organisms, and elementals. As an ecologist and radical queer, I see such languages and actions as negation of white affects and communicative norms that dominate Superfund cleanup, urban planning, river restoration, and other scientific bureaucratic spaces. Queer, trans, brown, and Black and Indigenous affects circulate in these processes as underflows at community river festivals, on fishing piers, and wherever people cruise the shorelines in search of unexpected encounters, human and otherwise. For Munoz, queer ecologies are both, quote, real space, actual place, and symbolic spaces and affective landscapes, the space of shared emotion and shared modes of feeling that cross space, end quote. And then there's a film that he talks about in this chapter called Wildness. In the opening shot of Wildness, the camera takes the perspective of someone cruising a car down Wölfle in LA at night, past MacArthur Park's dark lake, through a dreamlike landscape of red and gold and white streetlights, storefronts of taco shops, bodegas, a vibrant every night streetscape. Describing the opening shot of Wildness, Munoz commented, "There are so many slow shots that aren't just about establishing the location of the bar, but really about the city itself, evoking the bar's place in what I'm calling this queer ecology, which is an urban ecology that includes the natural and the unnatural, the organic and the inorganic." So there's more on that, but you can read it in the book. So with that introduction to Munoz, I'm going to just switch gears a little bit and talk about a second community-led research example, and then we'll come back to Munoz at the very end, if I have time. So these were slides that some of my students put together who have been working on this project at Tishanik to reconnect a river floodplain that was damaged by placer mining and then later on dredge mining, and is one of the three central ceremonial locations and also kind of urban centers in the Karuk world, where Pikyawish, which is the World Renewal Ceremony, is performed every fall. And so it's a really important place that the tribe did not have ownership of until recently, but has always, practiced these ceremonies there, and now has the opportunity to reconnect the river. And so these are shots from different workshops that we did to try to understand where the river was, where it is now, without trying to put it back exactly where it was, how we could open up some of those floodplain, flood processes, and then the floodplain, habitats and ecosystems. So we went there in March, did a lot of just walking around listening to Lisa Moorhead-Hillman and Leif Hillman, who are the co-PIs on the project. Did a little bit of measuring Indian potatoes and where they grow. This is to give a sense of how long this takes also. We reported back and iterated. So we did some reciprocity and doing some workshops with youth. These are some of the field sketches that some of the youth did, and they also made a video about the project. But we went on a river trip. We did some coppicing of willows, burning, and took these preliminary designs and got, as you can see, a lot of feedback from the community on what might work and what might not work on those. And then came out again in the fall to do help on a prescribed burn and do some beaver surveys and survey the river. And then, coming out from that, the tribe said, yes, okay, we want to go forward with this. It would be great to have a document we could give to the Corps of Engineers and other agencies on just the history. So we put together the 6-page brochure and the story map that are, our attempts as a collective of Native and non-Native folks to kind of translate the history and the vision in a way that's really centering the Karuk protocol. This is really different than how these types of projects usually happen. Usually agency will plan a large project and then basically have their design and come in and consult with the tribe and say, is this okay? And if they say no, they're like, well, too bad. We already spent $1 million on it. So you guys are familiar. So this is a really different, and part of the work that we're doing, that's in feminist science studies and in indigenous studies and in queer feminist science studies is like studying how this process is actually different. So what are the things that come out of this process that are different than that top-down process? So all of these different things that are not a research paper are all products, right, of that process that wouldn't have happened if we did it in a different way. And just as a kind of a theoretical frame around this, so this is a Karuk framework for research cogeneration, and they have a website about it, and like there's like 20 different principles within it. But in brief, so that's called Pikyav, which means to fix it in Karuk, and it's part of this world renewal and the responsibility that Karuk people have to renew the world every year. So practicing Pikyav, emphasizes indigenous-led experimentation and dialogue. Place-based practices of care are undertaken by scientists, designers, and cultural practitioners through our daily work. Practices include respective knowledge keepers, centering indigenous knowledge, power sharing, and tribal engagement, considering the political economy of research, i.e. who gets paid, epistemic diversity, tribal oversight, listening transparency, a lot of patience, and then giving back to the Karuk community in a number of different ways. So happy to talk about this more. There's a lot of different tribal specific, principles, but I think that this core is like, you can't go wrong, right? Like you could add, you could subtract, but like this is all really good stuff to do in, whatever community that you're trying to work with. So in the last 5 minutes or so, I just want to read a little bit more from this last chapter and show like a little bit more of the river. So some of these are, there's a project that my students were working on, and I helped out a little bit of trying to build these floating wetlands in the Duwamish to be salmon habitat. Kind of ill-advised, but I got to go out and swim in this slightly suspect river. Try to count whether fish were actually using them or not. Landscape architects come up with a lot of weird ideas, so it's always good to try them out. But anyway, that's some of the underwater pictures that you'll see. Yeah, let me just see. Yeah, okay, this is a little long, but I think we're gonna get through it. Let me just make sure. Yeah, okay, I'll just read a little bit of this and then I'll go to this other part. Okay, so this first part is more about cruising and it's called Unsettling Moves in Brown Commons. Waterfronts are queer spaces in a specific sense. They are sites of formative queer sex and sociality. In the late 90s and early 2000s, by night, I frequented, alone or in groups of punks and queers, a former dump become wetlands and thickets of fennel and abandoned power plants and train stations where we staged performances. We encountered other outcasts in passing or as traces, commons that were vibrant tapestries of emergent relations, what Munoz calls, quote, the swerve of matter, organic and otherwise, the moment of contact, the encounter, and all it can generate, being with, being alongside, end quote. Now, years later, along the Duwamish, alone or with other queers, I re-enter this mode of feeling in the world. The brown commons I am describing are not, quote, a stand-in for nature and the ways in which it is subsumed by private property, end quote. They come to be in a city that is, as Munoz writes, quote, not just a built environment, an object of capitalist consumption, but a living dynamic of cultural practices, intellectual circuits, affective networks, and social institutions. Not just as an enclosure of nature, but as its own common that is teeming with the potentiality of a kind of living otherwise that a full engagement with the commons can help actualize. In Seattle, settler land grabs displaced Duwamish villages along the eponymous rivers, tidelands, and floodplains. An engineering project dried up its Black River tributary, precluding salmon harvest at the village of Squatquat, which means confluence of waters in southern Lachute. From Seattle to San Francisco, To the San Joaquin Valley and along thousands of rivers in between, settlers viewed wetlands as wastelands that could be improved into property only by corralling the dynamic rush and flow of water, sediment, and organisms behind levee walls. These property relations are constitutive of ecological relations within settler colonial states. Property rights determine how people manage river and tidelands and constrain ecological study, cleanup, and recovery. I read Munoz's, quote, potentiality of a kind of living otherwise, end quote, as an incitement to unsettling, a call to disrupt property relations that began with and perpetuate colonialism. And so then there's more on that theory, but I'm going to just skip to a little bit more about the Squamish project. So with the key potentials of waterfront brown commons in mind, let us now walk back down to the edge of the water, a post-industrial shoreline along the Duwamish, which may share characteristics with a waterfront that you frequent. This urban industrial waterfront is water you don't get into. The brown commons can show how to think with such waterfront spaces about becoming the ongoingness of barnacles on the pier, fish in the water, muckleshoot fishers catching them in nets, and letnecks and low and white fishers catching them with poles, kids throwing stones into the water. Quote, brown commons are not made, one does not bring them into being, instead we become attuned to them, end quote. On the Duwamish, as along other industrial waterfronts, people make affective relations with one another and with the river by responding to and resisting regulation, gentrification, and official planning. I theorize these relations as underflows to governmental processes of shoreline erasure and repair. Munoz might call them traces. So habitat restoration projects, and this is that floating wetland in the background, can be engines of displacement and gentrification or serve as greenwashing for polluters. Duwamish Valley residents are acutely aware of this potential, thinking as the Brown Commons provokes restoration and redevelopment practitioners to confront, quote, uncanny persistence in the face of shared wounding. And all the quotes are from that Munoz chapter. It is this uncanny persistence that on many rivers and estuaries has impelled Superfund listing, higher levels of cleanup, and repair of ecological function. The remnant oxbow and island at Herring's House was preserved from dredging by Duwamish tribe members' blockade of bulldozers in the 1950s, and the tribe's work to unpoison the river is part of ongoing resurgence. Since John Beale began restoring Ham Creek in the 1970s, thousands of volunteers have come to know and fight for the river through shoreline work with him. The Duwamish River Cleanup Coalition have won funding for job training and youth environmental course and are fighting for affordable housing and clean industrial jobs as a bulwark against further gentrification and displacement. So far, these efforts have created small pockets of green wetland amid concrete or riprap-lined banks. These scraps have become touchstones for river restoration workers who imagine expanding them enough to let the ecosystem make its own way. But while youth, workers, and low-income residents are included in environmental justice consultation processes, other people who help make these brown commons are overlooked or dismissed as worthless and trashy. Abandoned piers where riffraff have late-night bonfires, the shady willow grove where houseless people sleep and relax, sailboat squatters, illicit moorings, and dinghy landings, the brown commons reveal such places as world-making projects by people, quote, cast out of straight times rhythms, whose subsistence or artistic livelihood is surplus to capitalist economies. Such spaces, unrecognized as brown commons, are often erased by planners building paved paths for joggers with strollers. Sometimes these illicit uses come back, as in the many parks along the Duwamish and the San Francisco estuary where unhoused people live. Perhaps other spaces and uses can be designed into shoreline repair projects, kids' dangerous playgrounds that leave trees and raw materials for shaping and reshaping, bathrooms and showers for the unhoused, and places to have bonfires. Brown commons can often persist if cities tolerate temporary structures like those that housed and homeless locals build with driftwood on Santa Cruz beaches every winter, and that the city bulldozers sweep away before summer tourists arrive. The Brown Commons refuses a cut along lines of respectability or class, and its demands for places to turn tricks, cruise, or shoot up are not assimilable into the planning process. So I think I'll leave it there so we have at least a few minutes for questions, but this is what it looks like in the bottom of the Duwamish River, and that's what it looks like when you come back up. And these are some of the people who helped with this project, so thank you very much. Would you say your name too?
Yes, absolutely. I'm Jennifer. She, her pronouns, PhD candidate here. I work with urban farmers and gardeners.
Awesome.
I loved my brain really caught on the idea of crip time in field work, especially as somebody who like has experienced like moments of disability or ability that have changed throughout my PhD program. And I'm also kind of wondering, like, so if you applied it there to field work, I'm wondering also if you have thoughts on crip time in the like research, community-based research process in general, like where like that like you said that happens over a much different timeline than
yeah
and so just wondering like what you see as the overlaps there.
Yeah, I think in general, like researchers have timelines that are driven by grants, and those are usually at most 5 years, often 3 or 2. And there's just not that much that you can do on that timeline. Obviously, communities differ widely. Sometimes there's a really urgent thing that needs to happen, like right now, like, on the Duwamish. I mean, there's always some, boat spilled oil and we got to go measure, or this flood happened and let's go get samples like tomorrow, and then it's like too slow. USPS takes 2 weeks to get out there, right? So I think there can be these different, not to say that community time is like always slower or native time, but working with communities, especially like frontline community groups, like they're often more cognizant of like, let's provide food, let's provide childcare, like let's make it possible for people to like, get compensated for their travel. So I think you can think about like taking disability studies ideas of like universal access, and you could broaden. I mean, I think some disability studies do this, but to be like, okay, let's have a meeting place where people can maybe not get COVID, or let's have, you know, what is the pace that will work? And so, yeah, I think the pace of life in academia is often really unsustainable and harmful and leads people to become disabled. So, I always like, and I myself am not very good at slowing down. However, I always encourage like my students and my colleagues, to like, this is not a sprint, this is a marathon. How can we, because there's also a different kind of thought that can happen when you're not like in a rush. And I think that is something that I really learned from my native collaborators where, for example, there's a picture of people on the raft on the river. And that was really important to these Leaf, that people need to go on rafting trips, the kids need to get out, families need to get out. And I'm like, okay, great. We're going to go to this river bar. We're going to collect some data. We're going to like list all the plants that are there. We're going to take a water sample. And they're like, just chill out. Okay. Like, don't do anything. Just let us lead this part. Like, it'll be fine. And all my students were like, but we're only here for 5 days. We have to get data. And then, we're out there for 8 hours and there's like the squirty things and having water fights. And, at one point, like, we looked at the levee that's blocking, and he talked about his vision, but it was like that going on that trip and just like actually just hanging out and not like being like a data collecting robot, like it like deepened my relation so much with people that I had been seeing at the office but had never talked to, or all of a sudden like, oh, well, what do you think about this? And you want to go for dinner? And oh, I have this idea. So I think like we can really get in the way of like learning from people who might have really different like lived experiences, observations that don't translate into scientific methods. And so thinking about, yeah, like just and like the ways in which we might be able to slow things down and thus make it possible for more people to be involved. So that's a great question. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Ah, I actually do not. I should have a credit for this, but it is for a bear that was in Alaska. Um, I probably Googled grizzly bear fishing, but it's just, such a beautiful image. And California used to have grizzlies, so it was when I was in California and I was dreaming, right, this utopian dream of bears fishing and just that like I don't know, there's something about that pose too. Like a lot of the affect theory is about how it's not like what we say, but how we hold our bodies that and you can like kind of like feel that in that image, right? That like that oh man, that picture's gonna be so young. But yeah, sorry, I try to cite all my photos, but that one I neglected. Question. Yeah.
I have a question. As somebody who works on cleaning up brownfields, and as a radical queer, I'm just curious. I just want to think a little bit more about how we can talk about cleaning up brownfields, but not clean up brownfields, and removing the. Because I know also some people feel like even the word contaminant can have racist overtones. So it's just, yeah, I'm just curious about terminology.
Yeah.
Legible.
I know everyone uses contaminant, and I think and brownfield, yeah. And so I think yeah, I think I started to think about like I think in part of what I read use like unpoisoning, or like just things that are also more just everyday language or something.
Yeah.
Because contaminant also doesn't sound as bad as poison, but when you have 850 parts per billion in PCBs, it's like, yeah, okay, it's a contaminant, but it's also a poison. So I don't know. I mean, I think that.
Yeah, I use language like removing harmful chemicals.
Yeah, I think that's good. I mean, I mean, like brownfields are very much like a planning. It's a process of like planning language, right? And of Superfund and redevelopment, and they have a different value than greenfield. There are certain types of uses that might be appropriate for a brownfield that aren't appropriate for a greenfield. So a lot of like, for example, renewable energy siting. People might say, let's put a bunch of solar panels there, a wind farm there. We're not going to try to restore it to what it was before because it's already a brownfield. So I think it's kind of a shorthand that people don't necessarily think about. And that's why I thought it was, when I started thinking about it in light of this Brown Commons, where Brown is, I mean, there's a lot of more words that he uses about Brown, like it's very, very rich. And so like, there's like this resurgence, there's all this stuff about south to north migrations, persistence, like all these qualities about Brown. So it was like kind of this like reclamation of Brown in a way that I think could make Brownfield be like, wow, a Brownfield, like it's so vibrant, right? Like if we can make it be not poisonous, we don't necessarily have to like erase evidence of industry, right? And I think this has to do somewhat with like monuments that you want to take down because they're racist, and what do you do with them? Like, do you just like melt them into something else? Do you hide them in the back of the museum? Do you leave them on display, but like contextualize them with other artworks? Like, I don't think there's like an answer. It's very situational. It comes out of the particular community that is there and what they think is appropriate. But I think like having that conversation around brownfields. And I personally, this is just like my personal opinion, right? But I think that oftentimes leaving some amount of evidence of like the really bad things that we did in the past because we didn't know better is important, However, that's not always true. So on the Salmon River, which is a tributary of the Klamath, there's like thousands of mining claims. So it's like hydraulic mine, just sluice the whole hillside into the river, leave your equipment there, and like leave these mounds of hub boulders basically in the stream. And so those mine tillings are registered as historic places and can't be removed because they're on the historic registry. Meanwhile, there's this total insult and affront to tribal people who can't fish because these settler like leavings are trashing up the landscape. And so this is like a problem, and they should be, on the other hand, some of the collaborators have been able to do these restoration projects where they're like, okay, we're going to leave this one piece of mining equipment. It's out of the floodplain. It's not interfering with the river being able to move in a good way, but we're gonna put a sign on it and remind people, hey, you know, they got this much gold out of here. This is how much money it took to fix it. This is how many fish didn't live because of it. Right? So I think there's like a lot of like Seattle has this park called Gasworks Park, and the brownfield, they're left the gasworks there. Like there's still some contamination, but it's also very heavily used, and there's a lot of signs saying, "Hey, don't go down there." So I think there's compromises that people make, and I don't know. I think I guess with brownfields, like I don't think it's the most amazing term because no one even knows what it means. But I think it could be reclaimable, maybe, but I'm not that invested in. I don't know. Any other questions? Okay, well, thanks so much for coming. Happy to talk 101, and yeah, love to hear your thoughts. And um, I usually bring a stack of books, but I forgot. But hopefully, you can get the